Far too often, LGBTQ plus business owners believe they have to choose between authenticity and being successful. Through these real-life stories, LGBTQ plus listeners aspiring for success can gain valuable insights to navigate their path to being both queer and successful. Hello, everyone. It is me, Hunter J. McNair, your hostess with the mostest, back again for this week's episode of Queer and Successful. Now, this week, I am joined with my good Judy, my good pal, Mel Dorman. Now, Mel and I were actually fortunate enough to have met this past fall at a conference, and Mel ended up getting this amazing experience to be a TEDx speaker. And Mel talked about how she has actually gotten six-figure income coming into her world through creative seller financing, which I know sounds like math, and we don't do math on this show, but listen to how Mel talks about changing our mindsets away from math to how am I creating space for my communities and for marginalized communities and building wealth for them. Now, if you have not yet heard, I just launched my signature course, The Success Prism, along with my signature training program, The Success Prism Network. So if you would like to learn more, go to hunterjmcnair.com. You can book me at your locations or you can join our training programs. It's a really cool thing to look out for. Other things to look out for, which are really great this week, are this episode. So I hope you take a listen. I'm so excited to have a good friend of mine here this week with us. And Mel, you and I actually had the pleasure of meeting before you were TEDx famous this past fall at the Real Estate Alliance conference. And I would say that your energy was instantly magnetic, and it didn't take very long for me to realize that you were someone I'd want to have on today with us today.
Oh,
So thank you for being
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so honored. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and you know, obviously your TEDx talk, you recorded that. What was that in like February?
I had that in October last year. It was supposed to come
Oh,
out in January. Um, yeah, but fortunately, I was picked for editor's pick, which TED does, thousands and thousands of TED Talks across the globe and domestically as well. And they only pick a handful of people each year that they really want to raise up and elevate their voice. And so I was one of those. So now I'm just waiting for TED to create a strategic marketing plan to boost it out to hopefully millions of people.
yeah, that'll be really exciting. And you actually were in the same, I guess, wave as our good friend here, Julia Lachey. So she
Yeah.
knows you as well. And yeah, I'm super excited to kind of talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is this kind of creative seller financing that has led you to six-figure passive income, which is like
Mhm.
wild to talk about. And I was telling you before we started recording, right, that I was like, I'm excited for myself to learn something really interesting today. For anyone who doesn't know who you are, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Mel Dorman. I currently am a top broker in Portland, Oregon. I'm also an investor. I built most of my portfolio using seller financing and other creative strategies. I used to be a social worker for many years, and then I discovered seller financing, and within 5 years, I built six-figure financial freedom by buying 34 rental units, mostly by working with people in my community directly instead of using a bank loan. And today I'm about to have a book that comes out. I've got a program where I'm teaching people how to do this in real life. And so that's where my focus is these days.
And you know, you started as a social worker and you shared a little bit of your story when we were at the Alliance conference. But what was the moment that made you decide that you needed to shift into real estate?
Yeah, great question. So I used to be a social worker for a long time, helping, folks out of homelessness, in people in jails, in hospitals, that sort of thing. And I really was passionate about helping people on the margins of society. who didn't have other options. And then I realized that my family were those people on the margins. My dad got sick with Alzheimer's. He was 67 years old and he was our breadwinner in our family. And so suddenly I realized that money mattered. And I really wanted to discover a way to build wealth, which led me to real estate. And that's what got me started. It was just, reading books and listening to podcasts like this and just learning as much as I can. And I started to make that shift.
Now, you didn't like run out the gate doing seller financing though, right? That was.
No, I didn't. No, my first deal was I did look for markets or for properties off market. I sent direct mail and I was really all in being an investor trying to figure it out. But my first one was actually with an FHA loan, and I was so excited. I found it off market. It came with $70,000 of equity built into it, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. And so as a social worker, that's what you'd make an entire year. And so when I realized that I was good at this, I was pretty convinced I wanted to get in full time. And just at that moment, after I closed on my first duplex, about a month into it, I found out that my dad was dying. And so even though my motivation was really to help my father, I realized, I was too late for him. And so that's when I really took it to the next level. And in an existential crisis, watching my dad work as a roofer for 50 years with nothing to show for it in the end, I decided I didn't want to go back to work again. And so I had $16,000 in my checking account when my dad passed away. I had one duplex I just bought, and I said, you know what? I'm all in. And I quit my day job and I just started doing real estate investing full time at that point.
Wow. And I know that's changed your life tremendously. So how many doors do you now have?
So I just consolidated last year. I sold a 20 unit and I got them like all in my neighborhood area. So now I have I went from 34 units down to 16 now.
Oh, only 16.
Yeah, only 16. Yeah, yeah. Much
Only,
more efficient, less
yeah.
trouble.
Are you managing this all yourself?
I manage most of them. I just turned midterm rental over to a property manager, and then I have one unit that's a little bit troublesome, so I gave it to professional management for that as well.
Smart. That's what you should do.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you've built this six-figure portfolio in 5 years, right? If we look
Mm.
at people think usually that, hey, if I'm going to build this massive portfolio, it's going to take me much longer than 5 years. So you've managed to achieve it fairly quickly. For people who are kind of new to investing, your strategy has been around seller financing specifically. What is it, and why is it such a game changer?
Yeah, so kind of going back to that moment where my dad passed away and I quit my day job, $16,000 in my checking account. I was like, what am I going to do now? Like, no bank is going to give me a loan. It wasn't 2007, this was 2017. And so banks had rules again. And so naturally, the first thing that I did was I signed up for a boot camp to learn about seller financing, which is when a home buyer pays a seller directly instead of using a bank loan. So it's just person to person payments. And it's like the seller becomes the bank, and the seller gets to keep all of the interest, unlike sending it to Chase or Wells Fargo or something like that. So it really is a mutually beneficial relationship. And once I discovered that, I realized I would have to find somebody who would be willing to partner with me, who was at that point unemployed, had about $8,000 in my checking account, and just was very ambitious and caring. I wanted to help people. I had a good intention, and I had a tool belt now. I understood how to do seller financing. And so I just sent out a bunch of letters and I started cold calling every day, just frantically looking for that next deal. And about 6 months into my efforts, I found my first seller financing property off market, and that's what started it all.
Now, did you do that all by yourself, or did you find someone crazy enough to go in with you?
I did that first one all by myself. Yeah, I, I'll kind of break it down for you, but I basically, when I was cold calling, I accidentally called this guy's attorney. And I thought I was talking to him, realized I was talking to his attorney, and then he informed me that the guy I was looking for was actually dead, which was a little bit
Oh,
awkward.
okay.
And,
Fun.
but luckily, me and this guy on the phone, his name was Kelly. We just hit it off. He was in bankruptcy attorney. So he was helping people who were on the margins. I was a social worker. I was also helping people who were, on the margins before that. And as a realtor, I was really targeting people who are pre-foreclosure. So a lot of business overlap there, a lot of care. And basically, like 3 or 4 months into the friendship, he just asked me, hey, can you give me a report on this triplex that I own? I'm curious. I think I want to sell it. And so I looked up the values. I saw that he'd owned it for about 20 years, and the light bulb went on. He probably has equity. And for seller financing, that's the most important ingredient. The seller has to have equity to lend to you. And so I knew in that moment, this is the one. This is the one I've been waiting for 6 months. And I showed up on that appointment and we walked and toured the units. And before I could even say anything to him, he actually said to me, I would like to seller finance this to somebody. And that started it right there. We we
Wow.
we sat down and ironed out all the details that night.
Well, I would say it was luck, but I always say luck is just when preparation and opportunity collide, right?
Exactly.
You were very intentional about making these connections and putting it to the forefront, and it opened up this opportunity that you wouldn't have had otherwise. With when you say that what's important that the seller has a lot of equity, are you specifically saying that they have a lot of equity or that they don't have a big loan amount on the property?
Yeah, so either one really. It's
Yeah.
whatever the seller has in equity is what they can lend. So if they have a first position lien on the property, they already have an underlying mortgage, you'll have to take care of that in advance, either with putting another bank loan to wipe out theirs, or doing a large down payment or raising capital with friends and family or something to wipe out that underlying mortgage. But if they own it free and clear, like Kelly did, then there's no, everything is negotiable at that point. So for instance, Kelly, at first he wanted $75,000 down, which would have been roughly 10%. Absolutely reasonable. A bank would require me to do 20%. So he was
Right.
asking a very reasonable thing. But unfortunately, as you know, I had no money at the time. So I just asked him, what would it cost for you to foreclose on me? And he's an attorney, so he knew that answer. And in Oregon, it's only $15,000. So I said, well, great. Why don't we make that the down payment? If I don't pay you, then you can use my own money to foreclose on me. And he thought about it and he realized, yeah, that's actually really good for me too, because he didn't want to pay capital gains tax. So any down payment that I gave him was going to be taxed additionally. So we structured it with interest only payments, and I gave him 15,000 down. Now, of course, I didn't even have $15,000.
I was gonna say, didn't you say you had like five or
Yeah,
something?
I had like eight, right?
Yeah.
So I
Eight.
had like no money in my account. So I was quick on my feet again. I said, would it be okay if I raised some money with friends and family for the down payment? And he said yes. So I picked up the phone, I made a few phone calls, and I ended up finding $10,000 from some friends, and they loaned it to me for a year. And so the way the numbers penciled, we did interest only payments, which made the payment come down about a third. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the difference between interest only and amortized, but got to keep a lot of money in my pocket. And then that allowed me to only have to put, so I came into closing with about $7,000 of my own, 10,000
Mhm.
from my friend. That made the 15,000 plus a little bit of money for closing costs. And what I did is I said, these two of the three units, they're vacant right now. Could I do a delay on that first payment and pay you in 2 months after I get them leased up? I mean, after all, if I don't have any money coming in, how am I going to pay you? And so
Right.
Kelly agreed, and what I ended up doing was recouping 6,500 of my $7,000 in those 2 months by renting up those units, which meant that I only was $500 out of pocket for a triplex in a really great neighborhood in Portland. So
Right. You're able to
structure.
recoup that in basically 2 months.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that structure, was really the toolbox that I had in my mind to be able to ask the right questions and to put together a deal that really worked great for him and for me too.
So next question is, what's that friend's number? No, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
right.
Are they still
Exactly.
around? Do they still shoot? No, no, I'm kidding. But I know that there's usually a lot, and we talked about this, a little about this before we started, but there's a lot of fear and kind of confusion around getting started in seller financing. What do you think some of the most earliest mindset blocks were for you, or really
Hmm.
for maybe would be for anyone, and how would you overcome them when we're talking about getting started in seller financing?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest hurdles is that we've all just been socially conditioned to think that in order to buy a property, we first go get a pre-approval from the bank, right? As a realtor, I can attest that that's usually the thing I'm asking first from my buyers. Do you have a pre-approval? We've really been conditioned to think that capital comes from the bank, but in reality, it comes from people too. If we have lend that together to one another. Can you still hear me,
Yeah,
by the way? Is that
you're great.
good? Okay. And so I think the biggest hurdle is really just that reframe, that thinking outside of the box, that imagining that you can write your own terms, that you can create a contract between you and another person. You don't need a middleman. You don't need a bank to make it smooth. And I think the biggest misconception is that it's too risky for the seller. Right? The buyer is in a good spot. They're getting a great loan and all that stuff. But I think most people, the first thought they have is, I can't trust my neighbor, which is
Right.
interesting, right? That's our first thought. We can't trust our neighbor. I could never make a loan to my neighbor like this. But what's interesting is, maybe $15,000 is what it costs in Oregon to foreclose. But because Kelly was willing to trust me, he gained about $250,000 in interest. And so I
Mm,
think there's a shift that we need to make in terms of risk, right? Which one's more risky? A guaranteed loss of $250,000 if you go the traditional way, a guaranteed loss, or a potential loss for $15,000 if you had to foreclose. And granted, that $15,000 was my money. He'd be using my money to
right.
foreclose on me, so it's not even loss for him. I think
Well,
that's the
because
biggest.
yeah, I mean, well, because the thing is that he's got enough equity. So if he has to foreclose on you, he can, because that'll be
Yeah.
easy, right? And then the biggest thing is finding someone who's willing to not get all their money up front if they're willing
Yes.
to get much more on interest on that back end, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, definitely one of the hurdles can be if somebody really needs all of that money up front, they're not a good candidate for seller financing. Now, most of the time when you ask somebody what they're doing with those proceeds, they don't actually need all of that money. They just think they need all that money. Oh, I got to go buy the next house. But like even in that scenario, think about it. If they're lending to you at 9% and their loan costs 7%, then they're cash flowing that difference, right? So it is in their benefit to lend to you interest only at 9% and make more money than they're paying the bank for that new loan.
Right, because usually in seller financing, you are going to have terms where you're offering higher interest rates.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. Yeah, it just depends on the situation. I mean, a lot of folks, who are older, their options for what they're going to get a return on, a safe return, is in those lower margins, 4 or 5%, right? They're comparing it to bonds, they're comparing it to these longer term annuities. But for somebody who's more savvy and maybe younger, they might be looking for those higher returns, 7, 8, 9%. I think it comes down to the sellers. So sometimes the seller is a younger person who does want a higher return, who's, expecting to place that money. Then yeah, I think the best thing for them could be solar financing because it is an asset that they know and they understand, they're familiar with, and a 4% or a 5% interest rate for them is a fantastic return compared to the 1 or 2% they might get in a CD or bond.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that you definitely need to be aware of math, right? Know your math into it because you want to be able to kind of control that conversation,
hmm
especially when you're having conversations with varying different generations and varying needs. Now,
hmm
like, people in general think that you have to have a lot of capital, right? To
hmm
get started. You've already mentioned that you didn't have a whole lot of capital.
hmm
Are there other creative strategies that you've seen people use to help kind of get their foot in the door?
Yeah, yeah. Besides seller financing, I mean, a lot of new investors, they'll start with wholesaling, for instance. They're just going out in the world and trying to find the right deal and then put that seller in contact with the right investor. They're not actually purchasing the property at all. And that's where I started in my own career, is just getting really good at those conversations and really good at structuring deals and stuff, and then not really being in a position to execute for it myself. I think that's a great way to get started. I also think for folks that are just getting started, if they're not able to find a seller finance deal, one of the easiest ways is just to put a 5% down conventional loan on a multifamily.
Yeah.
That's if you bought
Yeah.
one multifamily a year for 5 years that way, you could pretty much retire in 10 to 15 years just off the cash flow and stuff. And it's a very slow and steady way to get into real estate, but it works. And I have a lot of clients that have done that.
Well, I've heard about people doing like hard money loans too, right? Is that
Yeah,
not?
yeah, hard money loans are definitely possible. So hard money loan, the terms are usually 10 or 12% interest. You have to pay 1 or 2% points up front. They're very risky. They're best used on like a flip project where there's
Right.
an exit strategy coming up. You need to maybe even borrow the funds to renovate. A lot of hard money lenders will give you the money to renovate. But really it's getting the right deal. So using hard money, I mean, you make all your money on the purchase. So you have to get a screaming deal and really work it out. When I think about hard money loans, I think an alternative to that is seller financed is really to do a partnership with the seller. And so doing like a joint venture where you are the general partner, you're in control of all the decision-making processes, but the seller is going to get a part of the upside when you sell. So instead of saying, "Hey, I'm going to buy your property, I'm going to use hard money to pay you, seller, and then in 6 months I'm going to resell this and I'm going to have all that risk of the hard money and all the disclosures the seller's probably not going to tell you, like all those risks go away mostly because you're partnered with the seller. And so they want to tell you hey, the sewer's not so good. And hey, we got to fix
Mhm.
the roof because they know the property and now they're on your side. They want to maximize the amount of money that you can get. So it's a way to align your interests. that is still the structure kind of seller financing. It's just short term. It's only for like maybe 6 months they're seller financing to you.
Yeah, it's so funny because there's so many. I think the thing about when we say like creative financing or creative seller financing is that you can hear like you get creative, right?
Yeah.
Like you can make it work, but it's about
Hmm.
knowing the rules to the game so that you can
Hmm.
play it at a higher level, right?
Yes.
Like you've truly kind of like mastered this. I want to just know, how did you figure this out? Like what, I mean, what
Yeah.
was how did you just like one day wake up and go, okay, I know how to do all of this?
Yeah, so 7, 8 years ago when I first got into this, I went to a boot camp, a weekend boot camp, and I learned a lot of the principles there, which was great. But I think what was more important than that was actually that I learned them in the context of a community that was still in Portland when I came back. So that was weekend. I learned a bunch, but we actually met, maybe like a small group of 5 or 6 of us every week for breakfast, and we would talk about our deals, and we would use that new muscle we had developed of creative deal finance structure and how to think about terms and what questions to ask sellers and all that stuff. It really happened in the context of community. That's where that learning is, because it's a total paradigm shift and it's a way of thinking. It's almost like calculus, or it's a type of programming that you put your brain through, and then once you have that skill set, you just find other people in the community who also have that skill set, and you can just bounce ideas off each other, like, well, what if we amortized it? What if we did a small down payment? What if you closed in 60 or 90 days later? What if you did rent back? There's like all these aspects that you can really custom tailor the offer to the seller's needs, which I think is what's so beautiful about this. It's not a boilerplate. Most investors are like, all they care about is the price, right? It's just a big conversation about price and beating up the seller on the price. I will gladly overpay for a property for good
Right.
terms.
Right.
If I will give you an extra 20, 30, 40, $50,000 on that price tag if you give me a 4% interest rate over 10 years, you know?
Well, like you said, you're cutting out the middleman, if you may,
Hmm.
and really you're able to go in on your terms. And so it's a win-win, like you said.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because we do talk a lot about, you are the summary of the people you surround yourself with. And surrounding yourself with people who are having these conversations is really kind of like the starting point,
Hmm.
right? It's just getting into that flow. And don't say calculus again because trauma.
I know, right?
Uh,
It took me back there too.
you said calculus, and I was like, oh God. Now, I know though that you also focus on building wealth with purpose, right?
Yes.
And you focus a lot on, wanting to help marginalized communities and people also get more into investing.
Hmm.
What does building wealth with purpose mean to you? And how does that philosophy show up?
Yeah, great, great question. And to your calculus question too, or comment, I want to add, I'm not good at math. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people hear me talk about financing or real estate investing, but in school, I always got the comments, go back to elementary school with your math. Like I just do subtraction and addition. So I just want to, not discourage people. You don't have to be a math wizard to do seller financing. You just know how to add, multiply, divide. It's pretty much it.
Thank
Um,
goodness.
but yeah, to your point, I think what's so beautiful about seller financing is it's really about putting the pen in our hands, the authorship, the power that comes with being able to create our own terms. And it really puts the conversation back between two people rather than between us and an institution, us funneling money to Wall Street, basically. And so what I see is a movement, is really what I'm trying to create, and a different way of thinking how we relate to one another when it comes to real estate. And you know, according to ChatGPT, running this math alongside me, but approximately $400 billion a year leaves our homes in the form of $100 or $1,000 a month to go to banks and institutions in the form of interest. And that's like more than what Elon Musk is worth in net worth. It's more than half of what our nation has for net worth. It's an incredible amount of money. And really, if folks just understood that this process could be done on a person to person basis, it's a huge social justice movement that we can create, one that opens the doors of accessibility. Like just even a month ago, for example, I had a client reach out to me who wanted to sell a couple plexes, and her mom had just passed away. And when I met with her in person, I told her, the triplex is worth this, the fourplex is worth this. I think you can get about 550,000 for that duplex. But I asked her, would you like to make a lot more than 550,000 on that. And you could just see her eyebrows raise, like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
if you offered this with financing, it would be worth more. It's worth 550, that's what the duplex is worth. But if you added financing to the equation, many more buyers who are responsible, who live in your community would be interested. And as it stands, that community where that duplex was, I knew was walking distance from a mosque nearby. And if you know anything about Muslim culture or folks who are really adhere to Islamic law, you can't pay interest. Can't pay interest. So all of a sudden you have a whole demographic that does not fit into the bank box, right? So she was up for this, and I said, well, would you like to sell it this way? She said, yes. Well, sure enough, her tenant, who was a doctor making 350,000, very responsible guy, he wanted to buy it. So I just called him up and I said, could we add the amount that the interest would be on the course of the loan, just add it to the price? And now you have a 0% interest loan. And just like that, by
Wow.
writing our own terms, we created accessibility for somebody who would not have been able to buy a home. Totally qualified otherwise, very responsible human being, like that doctor, right? But he doesn't fit the bank box. And so there's all these types of demographics that have historically been discriminated against, but then are also not still fitting in the bank's box. Whether you're an entrepreneur, you know it's really hard to get a loan. If you're an artist, it's really hard to get a loan. If you're an immigrant, really hard to get a loan. These are all demographics that, if we did seller financing, would open up the floodgates of people who were able to buy. And I think more importantly, it's the sellers are turning their asset, their home, into an income stream. And as we're so trained to be consumers, to always just be buying, we're often not thinking about ourselves in terms of investing and being creators of wealth. And so I think it's a real paradigm shift to put ourselves in the role of creator and of designer of our debt, and doing it in ways that are mutually beneficial to uplift our communities.
Well, and I'm seeing this as a big shift, right? Like people really wanting to get back to, kind of cutting out the bank,
Mhm.
and I love that your book that's coming out into, is it less than 2 months now? About two
Mhm.
months
Yeah.
now, is the bank on your neighbor, right?
Hmm.
It has this
Yeah.
like double meaning of
Hmm.
like bank and then also depend. And let's kind of get
Yeah.
back to this like community uh,
Yes.
resourced system. I just exchanged eggs for cat treats yesterday. I'm quite proud of that. And so I think that's so cool. And I think, like you're saying, it's making things work for different groups.
Hmm.
Now, your TED Talk, Editor's Pick, congratulations again.
Thank you.
What key message from that talk do you wish that more people understood when it comes to money and community?
Yeah, I think the really big overarching theme of that talk
Yeah.
is that we collectively can redistribute wealth away from Wall Street back into our communities simply by working directly together.
Yeah.
It's a very simple concept, but it feels complicated because it's a new idea for most people.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is, this is how we used to buy and sell properties before the banks got involved. The banks only got involved in the 1930s, but before that, we worked directly together. And when banks got involved, yes, it expanded home ownership. We got the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. It made the American dream what it is. But we've gotten away from that because now, in many cities across America, you have to have $1 million to buy a home. It is so
Yeah.
out of reach. It has never been more expensive to buy a home in America. That dream has never been farther out of our reach, but it's only because of the way that we think about it. It's only
Right.
because we think we need a bank to get there. But if we realized it was just a conversation between two people, there's a infinite amount of possibilities that can come from that. It puts us in the role of creator instead of victim.
Right. It's kind of wild to think that in less than 100 years, right, our entire system for how we exchange real estate has changed and been put into the pockets of these people on Wall Street.
Yeah.
And, like you're saying, like homeownership feels so out of reach now that, even if you don't intend to do this for yourself, you should be thinking about how to do this for your other clients as well, right? The
Yeah.
ones who don't have a lot of money to put down and do need to make some creative decisions to actually find that dream again.
Hmm.
Now, I know you also coach and train, or rather, I guess, group coaching with a lot of other investors now.
Hmm.
Um, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see them making?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think the biggest mistakes come around what people think is possible. I mean,
Okay.
fundamentally, some of the earliest questions people ask me is what's the normal interest rate?
Mm,
What's the normal down payment?
right.
Right there. It's like I've already seen a window into their imagination that's so limited. What is everybody else doing? And I
Right.
think what I see most is that people just don't have an imagination for it. They don't understand that there's an endless amount of possibilities out there if you're willing to put yourself out there and to talk to a lot of sellers and really discover through a process of inquiry what is it that they need. And
Mm.
it's a completely different path than most investors, right? They send a postcard, it says 2 week, 2 week closing, all cash, no
Uh,
closing costs,
yeah.
that's not the conversation I'm having.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what people probably assume when they hear like, oh, seller financing, it's just like greedy and they're just trying to
Uh-huh.
like do one over on the seller. And that's probably a narrative painted from the big banks, right? Like
Yeah,
not
yeah.
truly, when we actually look at what the conversations look like. And funny, I thought you were going to say like doing the math wrong, but instead you said, no, the biggest mistake they make is not thinking that the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, yeah, it's really limiting themselves because the math is easy. I can show you a calculator. This is all things you could do when you're in third grade. X times X equals, this. It's like so simple.
Yeah.
What's complicated is mustering the grit to go out there and do it. What's complicated is believing that these things are possible enough that you put yourself out there and face that rejection over and over and over again. That's what gets complicated is the narrative and the stories that come into your mind as soon as you start to do something differently than the rest of the people around you. And that's where people get stuck, is they have a hard time believing in themselves and believing in the possibilities.
Yeah. Have you been utilizing, we talked about this before we started the call today, but have you been thinking and utilizing AI in any capacity to determine whether or not properties are good investments?
I haven't used AI for that. I will be using AI though, and have been using AI to help people draft their letters.
Hmm.
Every time you're sending out a new letter, it's a piece of marketing, and so you're testing it, right? What is the audience going to say to this? And so I think ChatGPT can be a great use of that. Giving some basic, this is who I am, and this is what I'm trying to accomplish. Write a really simple letter that a seller might be receptive to. Um, I think
I,
that's a good use of it.
I can see your website now having like a call to action button where it says sign up and get 10 free ChatGPT prompts for like
Yeah,
seller financing. We're going to talk later. I'm going to help you out.
right. I love that.
Now, I know you've created your group coaching or your cohort-based coaching program that focuses on real estate and relationship building. Why do you think connection is such a big part of your teaching style?
Yeah, great question. I think it was Harvard that came up with a study that determined 95% of our success in a new endeavor is related to who we surround ourselves with, which is
Mhm.
jarring. It's
Yeah,
almost like everything that I teach basically only makes 5% of people's success. But
yeah,
what makes the large majority of whether they're going to actually implement, where they're going to move from knowing to doing, is the people they surround themselves with because we learn through modeling. We learn by seeing people and recognizing their story and starting to believe that we could be in that same story. And so for me, when I was thinking, after years after I went to that boot camp. I returned about 5 years afterwards, and I wanted to give back and volunteer and kind of see, other people learn this process and contribute. And what I found remarkable when I visited is as I talked about all the people that I went to the boot camp with, 5, 6, 7 years ago, they had not had the transformation that I saw. I was surprised. A lot of their lives looked pretty much the same as it did when I met them. And so what I realized was my competitive advantage and the reason I was able to implement is because I did intentionally surround myself with people who were thinking this way, who were going out in the world, talking to the sellers, problem solving. I had a community doing it alongside me. So what felt abstract and abnormal and scary became inevitable. And it's almost like my success came by osmosis, by just connecting with people who are already doing it.
that's wild. And as someone, because I go around and train everywhere, as someone who goes around and trains, it's funny you say that the Harvard University 95%, 5%, because at the end of class, I'm like, people are going to take this and put it in a drawer and never open it again, right? And like, it's people are not intentional about taking the things they learn. So I'm looking at everybody here and everybody listening, taking the things they learn and then actually implementing a plan to implement it, right? To
Hmm.
put it in
Hmm.
place, to surround yourself with the people who are going to keep it going. So your group kind of, do you call it a cohort-based coaching program? I
Yeah.
call it. Okay. Is
Yeah.
that
Cohort
the same
based.
thing as, same thing as group, right? You just say like the
Hmm.
fancy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
Group coaching. Yeah.
okay, okay, good. So it's like a group coaching thing, that allows people not only to surround themselves, but it keeps it top of mind. It just keeps
Yes.
it top of mind for them and moving along. And
Yep.
I know that you've supported queer and mission-driven folks along this journey as
Hmm.
well, right? How does queer identity and value intersect with real estate investing in your experience?
Oh, it's such a good question.
Yeah.
Oh man, where do we start?
I know, right? How long do we
So,
have?
my running title for my book originally was going to be "Being Rich is Gay" because I really wanted to confront this overlap of
Being publisher.
social, yeah, of like the social conditioning that we have. For me, growing up in the church, growing up in a setting where women were told that your most highest and best use is to serve other people and that you need to be a contributor of society. I mean, there's no doubt as to why I became a social worker, and to have those sorts of values under my belt. But when it comes to building wealth, I had to do a lot of unlearning of that process. I had to recognize what are the ideas that were given to me and what were the ideas that I wanted to have for myself. And so, not seeing myself reflected in wealth. And when it's people like Corella DeVille or the Devil Wears Prada, right? Like women are evil or greedy or corrupt. But I think recognizing that like these stories about who I could be were just stories and that I got to invent who I actually was. I think that's critical. And as being a queer person in society, I think we have a special advantage in that we've already had to learn how to step out of the norm, exactly how to step out of the norm and how to authentically own our own desires. And becoming financially free is that. It's like
Yeah.
everybody's swimming in this stream. They're all getting the W-2 job. They're all just doing this. They're clocking in for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And if you step out of that line, you will get resistance. You're going to get people that are trying to talk you out of your dreams, that are telling you you're crazy. It will happen. Like when I came out as a real estate investor, I got just as much flack as when I came out as a queer person in a Christian community, right? Like it
Yeah.
was the same amount of, I can't believe you're doing this. Like
Right.
what are you doing? You're throwing your life away. But in retrospect, as I saw how I did it, I was doing it very differently. I was doing it in a way that helped people, that built up my community. Then those hearts and minds started to change. Just like when I came out as gay, at first, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're doing that. As they became a little more progressive in the way that they thought, they recognized, oh, that's not a bad thing. And so I think we have an advantage as queer folks to be able to authentically own what it is we want. And we've had that coming out experience, and we can really take a step towards financial freedom, and choosing our own path for ourselves. I think that's really beautiful.
Oh, I love that you said every bit of that. Well, even like the class we were talking about before the recording, we talked about my new course, The Success Prism, and it's all
Hmm.
about finding what success looks like for you because we
Yeah.
are kind of raised and, taught that we have to fit this box, right? And
Hmm.
that shows up when we do go to come out because we don't fit that box. And it
Hmm.
shows up again the more and more that you go along through your journey towards success because everybody is wanting you to fit into this square box. And I don't
Hmm.
know about y'all, I know square, I'm a star, right?
Yeah.
So I
Exactly.
fit in that box. Um,
Exactly.
and so it's fascinating you say that. I like that a lot. And I think it's ironic about the everyone thought you were crazy when you were going into real estate is when I left Sears, RIP, when I was young and started to go into real estate, the people who were ahead of, above me were like, you're crazy, right? Like what you're
Hmm.
going to do is you do get that similar experience when you're going to be an entrepreneur as you're coming out. Not sometimes not as extreme, but
Yeah.
but along the same lines. And yeah, I mean, when you are able, which you're able to do so well, to repaint the narrative on
Hmm.
what seller financing can not only do for yourself, what it
Yeah.
can do for the seller, but also what it can do for the community. It
Hmm.
allows you to create a space that fits your star,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And that's
Yes.
something that people need more of, right? We need more of that. We need more spaces that fit stars.
Yes.
So your upcoming book, Bank on Your Neighbor, drops
Yeah.
in July. Other than what we've talked about, and maybe there's more, what are the things like inspired it? And
Hmm.
what can readers expect to walk away with it?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, I I originally decided I wanted to write this book. I have this strange thing in my life where I make agreements with the universe. Okay, this is gonna sound a little odd, but I'll give you an example. The first agreement that I made when I was an undergrad is I went from being a business major and maybe becoming a psychologist, that was the path I was on, to I'm going to be a social worker and I'm not going to make very much money. And so the agreement I made with the universe on that one was, all right, if I take this path, you got to pay off my student debt, which sounds absurd, but that was my mindset. And I'll tell you what, on graduation day, an anonymous donor paid all of my debt. And
What?
so that was the first time I realized, oh, when I align my interest, what I'm trying to do, with the interest of the universe, like the universe trying to do good things, and I align those two things, and there's a good likelihood that they'll come together. So that was my first experience of that. So then the second time, I find out my dad has Alzheimer's, right? And I'm like, what am I gonna do? And I have no idea how to build wealth. So I'm like, okay, universe, next agreement. If
Mm.
you teach me, if you allow me to build wealth rapidly, I will tell everybody I know how I did it, and I will try to use this for the betterment of the world. So I was able to achieve that goal in 5 years, and then it was about me returning on my part of that deal, right? My promise. And so this book is my part of that deal. Me turning around and saying, "This is how you do it. You can do it too." And so, yeah, it's really birthed out of that desire to help people learn in a practical way how to build wealth through real estate, through seller financing.
Wow, that's insane. And what is the universe's number? Because I have
Yeah.
loans that I would like to have paid off as well. Uh,
Right?
so backing up, you actually had an anonymous donor pay for your student loans.
Yeah, yeah. And I was, I can't even describe this to you because I really just in that moment, I was like maybe my sophomore year when I
Yeah.
made the shift in my major. It was just like, yep, that's what's happening. I just absolutely believed it so much so that I was in my senior year, and this guy I was dating at the time, he was like, "What are you gonna do after you graduate?" He was like, "I'm gonna go teach English overseas so I can pay my debt." And I literally said the words, "I'm not worried about it because my debt's gonna get paid off by a stranger." Like,
And that
are you
happened.
kidding me? And like as the words came out of my mouth, I was like, oh my gosh, I sound like a crazy person.
Well,
Like it really sounded wild. But I just couldn't deny the fact that's exactly what happened. And to your point earlier, it's like you put yourself in situations like, how does luck happen? It didn't
yeah.
happen by chance. I signed up for a program to go work with women overseas in India in a red light district, helping them out of sex trafficking. The person who chose to pay off my debt read my application, saw the vision that I had for my life because I was like, I'm not letting debt stop me. I'm going to go help somebody. I'm going to go help these women come out of sex trafficking. And so I had that alignment with the universe's goal. Boom. Yeah, they'll fund it. No problem. You know, it's like you're setting your intention, you're chasing that dream, and you don't worry about the how, right? You just worry about doing the thing that you said you're going to do. And so same thing for this book. It's like I don't like I'm not an author. Like I
Yeah.
didn't go to school as a literary person, but I just resourced myself. I hired coaches, I hired a team of editors, I hired people to teach me how to be a good author. And so now I've been able to produce a really amazing product that I could never have done without with the help of my team. But yeah, to answer your question, I think it's really important to align our interests with the greater good of the world, and it really just it's a motivation thing too, right? Like for me, if I'm going out there trying to build wealth for me, it's
Mhm.
not very motivating.
Right.
Like,
True.
who
Yeah.
cares
There
if
has to
I
be a
get wealthy?
bigger, it has to be a
Yeah,
bigger why. Yeah.
yeah, it's like connecting yourself to that stronger why is what gets you up in the morning going, you know what? I'm going to figure this out. This is not just about me. This is about my community. This is about making an impact in the world and having a response to all the news and the media and all the like sadness and the challenge that we're experiencing in the world right now. I'm not going to sit and wallow in that anxiety or that depression or that fear. I'm going to take those emotions and I'm going to transmute them into something that's positive that actually it is putting me in the role of creator instead of victim. And I think that's just a powerful way to live your life.
I agree. And what's ironic about this conversation is I'm like a big energy person as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
right? I'm like, well, whatever energy you're putting out, like energy is never lost or never goes away. So
Mhm.
you have to be careful of what you're putting out because it will come back and you kind of
Yeah.
this positive realm has allowed you to create positive effects for yourself. And I really need to go back in time and talk to the universe about my student loan debt.
Yeah.
Still now really upset about that. And I think that's a great message though to So just really like when you're committing, you're really committing, like think about what you're committing to in life as like you're committing to the universe about it and
Hmm.
putting it into the forefront. Your why has helped you stay focused and resilient through challenges. Do you help people kind of focus on that a lot when we're talking about this or when you're in these kind of group coaching settings?
Yeah, a lot of so it's a 3 month program, and really that first month is laying the foundation for these paradigm shifts that you need to make in order to stop behaving in this consumer fashion that really leads to financial instability and financial disempowerment. And so a lot of it is retraining the mind on how you think about yourself, how you think about money, how you think about what is possible. It's all this retraining, and then it's also laying the foundation of like how does real estate work? How do you run the numbers? How do you analyze something? How do you know it's a good purchase or not a good purchase? And so yeah, I think mindset is, I know people talk about it a lot, but it really can't be talked about too much because
Really can. It's like 97% of it.
yeah, it's like 97% of it. It's like I would love to teach everybody all the tools, and I do, but I'll tell you none of that matters if you can't pick up the phone and call a seller or put some mail in the mailbox and talk to them that way. Like if you can't do the action, there's no point in learning it. And so yeah, it's really a lot of mindset work.
Yeah. Well, like we've been talking about, it's that complete reframe on your approach to it completely. Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, before we wrap up and move on to any questions that people may have, what is one small but powerful action that someone listening to today could take to start their journey toward that six-figure financial freedom through real estate?
Hmm. Okay. That's a great question. I mean, obviously, picking up a copy of my book in a couple months would be great, but I
We'll send
think,
out the link when you have it.
yeah, exactly. Because there's just not a lot of resources out there. I'll be honest. There's not a lot of resources on seller financing. So, today, I think if somebody's just trying to get started, I think what the best thing that they can do is start to recognize their own thought patterns that are getting in the way currently. And so one of the things that I do in my program is I really try to slow down this process and teach people cognitive behavioral therapy, which if you're familiar with that, it's just tracking how do your thoughts impact your feelings, impact your behaviors, impact your results. And a lot of people go through life not really understanding that they are the most influential character in their life. And a lot of people go through life thinking that it's their boss or their spouse or their friend or whatever. If only they would change, if only they would get it together, then life would be okay. But all of those thoughts are really putting, the ego in the driver's seat of your life, and you're running off these narratives and these stories, and that whole time while you're spending all your thought energy blaming others, you're missing out on where you can be co-creating your reality. And so I think it's pertinent just to put people in the driver's seat of their own life as a foundational step. And so if it were me and I was just getting started at this, the first thing I would be looking at is why do I think this is not possible? Why do I think I need to work for 40 or 50 years in order to retire? Why is that my assumption? Because there's so much like cultural conditioning, so many messages that we've received that this is the prescription. Go to school, go to college, rack up a bunch of debt, buy a single family home, pay it off over the next 30 years, get a good job, clock in and out. That's what we do. That's adulting, right? But it's not.
Yeah.
That's being a consumer. It's being dependent on a system. It's being dependent on an employer for your revenue and for your income. But when you start to see yourself as a creator, as somebody who's able to author your own direction, to author your own terms, to create your own portfolio, and to create a portfolio of passive income so that you don't have to work anymore. When you see yourself as somebody who can do that, I mean, everything becomes easier at that point. So I would say visualizing that, spending time thinking about what would it look like to be that type of person is a really good first step to opening up your imagination of that possibility.
All I could think about the whole time was be the main character, like give yourself main
Yeah.
character energy.
Yeah.
Like yeah, it is kind of fascinating. And you mentioned ego, and I think that's a fascinating thing as well. And we have I have a lot of conversations about ego with business owners, especially because what gets in your way is often ego because it's without that why,
Yeah.
right? We talked about that why. And if you don't have a good enough why, that's why people quit things so much. That's why
Hmm.
they don't pursue them. So having those more constant conversations with yourself is definitely the first step.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I discovered along the way of writing my book was just this concept of self-determination.
Mhm.
What strengthens somebody's self-determination? And they had this really great scale that showed like from apathy, like absolute, I don't care, I'm not going to do anything, to fully self-actualized, living your most embodied vision of your life. And really the difference was whether you were doing it for other people or whether
Mm,
you're doing it for yourself. And the
mm.
more that you move through that scale, and the more that you move up the ladder of self-determination, the closer you are to doing things because you want to do them. And that's really where that personal empowerment comes from.
I love that. I
Hmm.
love that a lot because I talk about that a lot. Just
Yeah.
moving towards your purpose and what you want to do and not being so attached to what everyone thinks about it and feels.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just so fascinating that we turned a conversation about seller financing into one about let's change the way we look at things so that the things we look at will change.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Mel. This is very great. I want to move into anybody who may have any conversation or questions, but I'm so looking forward to seeing your book come out in a month and a
Yeah,
half. We're going to have to like share it in the group as well. It'll be great.
absolutely.
Thanks for listening today, friends. If you enjoyed this call, do not forget to join Queer and Successful, the community on Facebook, as well as register to participate in these calls live every Monday at 4 p.m. Eastern at successfulcall.com. See you next time. Bye.